Okay, I want to talk today about something called the narcissism of small differences, or the narcissism of minor differences, as it's sometimes known. And this, with the announcement that Bernie Sanders is running, he's now in the 2020 primary. It's a really important conversation for the left to have. And it's an important conversation because of some of the factions that are developing on the left. In short terms, in sort of like the briefest way to define this, the narcissism of small differences is when the small differences that separate certain people are overstated to such a degree that they appear to be massive differences and cause conflict when there really doesn't need to be any conflict. This goes back to the 1920s and Freud, actually, but there's lots of different interpretations as to where this originally comes from. But the idea is we become narcissistic about our own views on small differences with other people. Why this exists is open to some interpretation. There's one idea, more from Freud, that there's a kind of satisfaction to humans of an inclination to aggression, a mild inclination to aggression. And if it seems like we agree on 95% of stuff, of political issues, for example, something in us becomes satisfied when we find something we can be aggressive about or hostile about with other people. So we focus disproportionately on the 5% difference rather than the 95% agreement or similarity. Another idea about where the narcissism of small differences comes from is that there's just a kind of general desire to be different. And so when we see that we have a lot in common with someone else, we have a resistance to feeling that we're just like them. So we will find small differences to argue about so that we feel unique. Christopher Hitchens had many interesting commentaries that sort of circled around this idea. The reason that this matters is that when you become consumed by minor differences, things start to become exclusionary. I'm separate from those who have this minor disagreement with me. And we start to focus on the trivial and kind of miss the forest for the trees, to use a metaphor. So let's now look, starting with the 2020 primary, at how this is starting to manifest already. It's a primary, right? So we've got to make a choice between the options. We do have some duty to figure out what are the differences between the candidates. And there are important differences. But then there's also minor differences that are not, practically speaking, super important. Let's look, for example, at Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. On policy positions, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are very, very similar in terms of where they've ended up. Now, I've pointed out to you, Elizabeth Warren comes from the center more and has been pulled to the left. Bernie comes from more of a left socialism perspective and has been pulled towards pragmatism. He and Elizabeth Warren have basically ended up in the same place on most policies, not on all. Great. We don't have to go crazy arguing about Warren versus Bernie in the destructive way that I'm already starting to see friends do on Facebook. They're two of the leftmost candidates. They are arguably the two leftmost members of the United States Senate. If either of them won the primary, I would gladly vote for either. Let's not allow narcissism over small differences to cloud that they're not only obviously better than Donald Trump, but they're mostly better than a lot of the other Democratic candidates as well. In geopolitics, we have lots of examples of the narcissism of small differences. The partition of India and Pakistan is an example that maybe is less well known, but a good example. I'll take this head on. Let's look at an example that's related to me. There are people on the left who disagree with me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's explore this like adults for a second, since I know many of you are probably already thinking about that. How significant are our differences really in practice? I would imagine that I and most of my audience agrees that the current Israeli-Palestinian status quo is unacceptable. I imagine that we mostly agree that Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to be an arbiter of peace in the Middle East. I think we all basically agree that the Palestinian people are being treated like crap as a result of what's going on, and we need the most direct path to ending that we can possibly find. I would assume my audience and I mostly agree that the blockade on Gaza has to be lifted as a top priority of whatever agreement is made as soon as an agreement is possible. On settlements, I think my audience mostly agrees with me that new settlements must stop, and as many as reasonably possible are going to have to be dismantled as part of an eventual long-term peace deal. Where might we disagree? I've said that I think there are probably some settlements that might have to be land swapped in an eventual agreement. Maybe some people in the audience disagree with me about that, but it's a relatively minor difference. My audience and I are, I believe, on the same page in opposition of moving the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So in the end, the differences are relatively minor, but there is a tendency to focus on those differences, overstate them, and end up losing all possibility of sensible conversation on that basis. So what does this mean for 2020? What does this mean for the left going forward? What this, I think, means, what I think the takeaway has to be, is let's understand that in general, the narcissism of small differences is something that can be destructive. Let's further our understanding, even in just thinking back to the interview that I just did, that social media makes this way worse because it leads to a situation where oftentimes people are interacting on social media only on the basis of the small disagreements. You're not likely to tweet back and forth with people or to simply comment on YouTube about how you agree about 95% on about 95% of issues with someone else that's on YouTube or on Twitter. You're likely to engage only on those small differences, and that just exacerbates the problem. And the last thing I will say is that as important as it is not to fall into the trap of the narcissism of small differences, let's not mistake real differences as small, right? So one example, Trump versus Hillary, as we are now seeing with the embarrassment of the US on the world stage, the Supreme Court decisions that Donald Trump has made and everything else, some people incorrectly assessed the difference between Trump and Hillary as small in 2016. That's also a danger. We have to recognize serious differences where they exist. Look forward to hearing from you about this.